Hashem, today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Hamavav, Zevachim 36. We're going to start on the bottom of Lamed Hey Amud Beis at the Mishnah, continuing with our discussion of the laws of Pigul. So we know that Pigul is if a person slaughters it with the intent to eat it beyond the proper time, and then he eats it, then he gets kares, or if he intends to eat it beyond the proper place, then it becomes disqualified, not a kares penalty. But let's say he intended, says our Mishnah, shachtu amanas laniach hastam. If he just slaughtered it with the intent just to leave over the blood and not to sprinkle it or olimurav, or leave over the limbs, lamachar. Meaning to say he just he did shlita with the intent to leave it over, but not to eat it. So under those circumstances, Rabbi Yehuda posel. Rabbi Yehuda says under those circumstances that it's going to be disqualified. And the Chachamim are machshir, and the Chachamim say it's kosher. Manas, we'll have to see why. Now, the position of Rabbi Yehuda that it's disqualified is going to be the one that's unusual, because we have a general principle that the only thing that's disqualifying is either shalol lishma by the Pesach and the Chatas, the wrong intent, or beyond the proper time, beyond the proper place, but not to just leave it, but to eat it, or to sprinkle the blood, or to bring the limbs beyond the proper time, or beyond the proper place. So Amanas Litanan al Gabi Akavesh says our Mishnah just to put the blood in the wrong place on the ramp, or Shalok Keneged Yesod, or not opposite the foundation, or Litanis Anitanim Lamalo Lamata Vetitan Lamata Lamalo, or to put the blood in the wrong place on the altar. Asitanim Bifnim Bechutz, or Asitanim Bechutz Bifnim, or to put what's supposed to be inside, outside, or what's outside, inside. Outside the sanctuary, inside the sanctuary, or in the wrong place, sheyochu tameim, or you slaughter with the intent that tame people should eat it, or sheyakrivu tameim, or that a kohen who's tame should bring it, or sheyochu arelim, or that the non-circumcised kohanim should eat it, or sheyakrivu arelim, or that the non-circumcised should bring it, or l'shavar atzmos hapesach, or you slaughter with the intent to break the bones of the Korban Pesach, which is not allowed. You're not allowed to break the bones of the Korban Pesach. It's a prohibition. Or to eat it in a manner that it was not either raw or not roasted. That raw means not roasted. So or to mix its blood with disqualified blood. In all these cases, we're going to say it's kosher. Because the only way thought in disqualifies if it is bechutz mano or chutzlam komo. If it's the thought is to eat it or to do an action similar to the eating beyond the proper time and beyond the proper place. Chutzlam mano, chutzlam komo. Pesach v'achata shalishman, or the Pesach and the chatas without the right intent. So the Gemara says, why does Rabbi Yehuda say of a machshava la'niach, the intent just to leave it over? Why does Rabbi Yehuda say it's disqualified? My time is Rabbi Yehuda, because the Chacham's position is consistent. So Rabbi Elazar Trey Kraik Siva. So he says, Rabbi Elazar says there are two psukim that Rabbi Yehuda is basing himself on. First of all, benosar, when about meat that's left over that you're not allowed to eat, expired meat beyond the proper time. That if you eat it, it says lo susirim mimenu at boker. You're not allowed to leave it over until the morning. And so we know that that's a prohibition, and that's by the Korban Pesach. And also by the Korban Toda, it says, Kasuv Echad Omer, by the Thanksgiving offering, it says, Lo Yaniach Mimenu Ad Boker. It says you're not allowed to leave the Korban Toda over until morning. So, Imeinu Inyan Laniach, we don't need it to tell us Laniach, because we already know for the Korban Pesach, presumably can't leave it over until the morning. So therefore, Taneu Inyan Machsheva Sinuach. So apply to tell us about you can't have an even intent to leave it over, which is itself a tremendous chiddush, but that's the assumption of the Gemara. So Rabbi Yehuda, so Gemara asked the question, Rabbi Yehuda, is that what he's saying, that the second pasuk is teaching us about machshava laniach, that you can't have the intent to leave it over? I mean, don't we need it for the following brayso? So Basar Zevach Todas Shlamav. It says in the verse that this is the meat of the Zevach Todas Shlamav. What do we learn from here? We learn from here that the carbon toda can only be eaten for that day and that night. And chalipin, not only the Thanksgiving offering, but let's say you have a chalipin and you had to exchange it. You lost the initial animal and you replaced it, or vlados, or the offspring of the toda, or tamuros, or if you did it's called a tamur, an exchange of the animal. You try to switch it. In all these cases, how do we know? How do we know you have one day and one night? Tam Omer ubasar, it says in the verse ubasar. Chatos v'asham minayin. How do we know that by chatos and asham that also you have this limitation on this time? Tam Omer zevach u'minayla rabos shalmei nazir. How do we know also the shayal nazir, the ram of the nazir, that also requires bread like the Thanksgiving offering? How do we know that you also have this limited time? The Shalmei Pesach, and here Rashi says the Shalmei Pesach is the Chagiga that's brought on the 14th day, but not a carbon shlamim in general, because that you have 2 days. So, but Shalmei Pesach, how do you know? Tam Omer Shlamav. And Lach Metoda V'chalos Urikikim Shebenazir Minayin. How do I know that the bread of the Thanksgiving offering and the chalos and the rikikim of the nazir, these different wafers or bread offerings that the nazir brings, how do we know also that you have this limited time? Tam Omer Karbano. And Kulanat Korani Bahen Loyaniach. About all of them, I say this concept of Loyaniach. So that's what the verse is teaching us. And so anyway, we see from here that this pasuk is needed to teach us about that, this concept that you can't leave it over until next day, and applies in all these other cases. And so therefore it's not free to teach us this concept of machshava sinuach, that it's a prohibition of the intent to leave it over. The Gemara says, so the Gemara says, Im kain lemakra lo so siro. No, Rabbi Yehuda would say if that would be the case, was just teaching us those areas, it would have said lo so siro. Again, like I said the first time, my lo yaniach. But why did it say this extra words of lo yaniach? It's to teach us this concept of the prohibition of machshavas aniach, thinking about leaving it over. Gemara says, okay, for this teaches us the prohibition of puts, that leaving it beyond the proper time. But what about lahotzi? How about the idea that machshavas lahotzi, that the intent is to take it out and just leave it, is also prohibited? Ma'ikol meimar va'od, and furthermore, in the Gemara says, time of Rabbi Yehuda, you don't bring me a verse to give us the proof for Rabbi Yehuda's position. Svarahu, he could have proven it through logic. And svara is, in this context, we're saying that a logical argument is even greater than a verse. Time of Rabbi Yehuda svarahu, the Tanya. It's a very important concept that even though a verse is the word of God, but a svara is even greater. Logical is even greater than a verse. How do we know that? The Tanya, we know that it's logical because we have a brayso. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said to the rabbis, "Iatem modim, don't you admit sheminichu amachar, that if you had left over the meat until the next day, shehu pasol, will be disqualified. So too for sure, afchishe v'anichu amachar pasol. So if you would actually leave it over till the next day, be disqualified. So for sure, if you just had the intent to leave it over for the next day, it should be disqualified. This is again dubious logic, but that's to my humble opinion, it seems not necessarily intuitive, but that's the logic. The Gemara says, "El time with Rabbi Yehuda svaro." So the basis of Rabbi Yehuda, that if you would leave it over, that if you have the intent to leave it over to the next day, it's disqualified, because if you would actually leave it over, it'd be disqualified. So for sure, the intent to leave it over is also disqualified. So now the Gemara is going to go through, well, if that's the case, why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda say his position by the other cases? Boker Tov, we're on the bottom of 36a. The Niflog Nami Rabbi Yehuda Bekulu. So Rabbi Yehuda should say in all of these cases that we said in our Mishnah that the intent is not disqualify. Rabbi Yehuda should say actually the intent to do them does disqualify, and you should argue with the rabbi in all the Chacham and all the other cases of the Mishnah. Where it says no. Behind Niflog, with which other cases should he argue? Bishover atzamos, maybe he thought that he was going to slaughter the animal with the intent to break the bones of the Pesach. Bishover atzamos Pesach, or to eat from it not roasted. Zivcha gufe mi mipsal. Yeah, that's a prohibition, but the carbon itself wouldn't be disqualified. What about almanashi yahu tameim v'shekrivu tameim? Let's say he slaughters the animal with the intent that a tame person should eat it, or that a tame person would bring it as an offering. Again, zivcha gufe mi mipsal. The carbon itself wouldn't be disqualified. It's just a prohibition. Not just a prohibition, it's a prohibition, but the carbon itself is not disqualified if they did that. So that the uncircumcised will eat it, or that the uncircumcised will offer it. Again, zivcha gufe mi mifso. Again, is the carbon itself is not disqualified under those circumstances. And lishna achrina, an alternative. The Gemara gives an alternative answer. Hold on, I just want to check back one thing. The Gemara says, hold on. So the Gemara says, Lishna achrina kol kamine. Is it in his control? Meaning, say it's not in his control. If he says, I'm going to slaughter with the intent that a tame person will eat it, how is he going to make sure that a tame person is eating it, or that the aro will eat it? How does he know that this aro will come along and eat it? Now, theoretically, again, there you could have the idea maybe he is a tame or he is the aro, but then it would have already been disqualified. So, or if he has the idea to mix the blood with the disqualified blood, why is Rabbi Yehuda there not say that it's disqualified? Because Rabbi Yehuda Tamei the Amar Shalom da ein dam mevatel dam. Rabbi Yehuda follows his logic. He says that if you mix with other blood, the other blood does not nullify this blood. That was what we said yesterday's daf. Our Fulatzi has the idea he slaughters it with the intent to put the blood in the bone place. Again, this is we're reviewing most of what we've said the past week. Rabbi Yehuda follows this position where she says not in the proper place is like the proper place, we call it. V'liflog b'nisan b'fnim. Well, he should argue in the place where you have an intent to bring the blood inside the sanctuary when it's supposed to be outside, or outside when it's supposed to be inside, and that should disqualify the offering. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'll read the Rashi here. It'll explain it better than I can, obviously. Because Rabbi Yehuda, the position says Rashi, that if you have the thought process to take something that is supposed to be outside and you bring it inside the sanctuary, if that's your thought, that's not disqualifying. Because by the thought process of beyond the proper time or beyond the proper place, really we change it to nachutz l'zman chutzim komo. Because kasuv shlishi, there are three things that you require. It says the word shlishi there for darshinan, and we say that it has to be a place chutz mishuash. It needs to be a place that is mishuash, bedam basar uveimurim. That is to say, beyond the azara. So it has to be unable to do any of those three things. Chutz lazar mamish. That and all of these cases when they did the bamos, that it was allowed to do all of these cases when they were allowed to bring the blood there, the meat, and the emurim. And so therefore, Hilkach says Rashi, there is a cost of the pasuk chutz l'komo. It's a verse that beyond the proper place is disqualified, but to bring it inside, that's not an intent. Meaning to say the prohibition of chutz l'komo only applies beyond the courtyard, but not inside the sanctuary. That's the upshot of this teaching, because all three of them are allowed, would have been allowed by the Bamos. Rabbi Yehuda Isfar. So then the Gemara asks the question: does Rabbi Yehuda really adopt? Rabbi Yehuda Isfar. Does Rabbi Yehuda really adopt this position that a makom meshulash, that in order for it to be prohibited by the thought of chutzim komo, it needs makom meshulash, and so therefore the intent to bring the blood of the sin offering inside the sanctuary does not disqualify it? So does he really say that? It says davara It says in the pasuk, what do we learn from those words? Anything bad? It's to teach us. It adds this idea that it's to teach us this idea that you're not allowed to slaughter an animal that has a blemish. And then it says devara. The Torah is teaching us that you're not allowed to slaughter a sin offering in the south of the courtyard, and also a chatos that you're not allowed to bring its blood inside. So therefore, if you thought these thoughts during the shechita to bring them into the sanctuary, it would be disqualified. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda should have disqualified if you had that intent, because from this other brisa, he says that is disqualifying thought. So the Gemara says, and furthermore, not only that, Rabbi Yehuda's position here contradicts a different Rabbi Yehuda in the brisa. Lace Rabbi Yehuda shlishi. Does Rabbi Yehuda not? So the Gemara says this idea that we just said that Rabbi Yehuda does disqualify it if you have the thought to bring the chatas inside. Doesn't that contradict the different price of Rabbi Yehuda? Because we learned in the Mishnah later on Pei Beis Vatananam Rabbi Yehuda Hechnis b'shogeg kosher. That Rabbi Yehuda said that in the circumstance where you brought the dam of the chatas accidentally into the temple, if you did accidentally, it's kosher. Habamezid possible, but if you would bring it in intentionally, it's disqualified. The kaimoan, and when do we say that? When is it, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is it disqualified? Only b'shekiper, only where you poured it on the golden altar. Hashto ma hasam ayli ayla keeper in will keeper. Well, in that case, even if you brought it in, it's only disqualified if you actually applied it. For sure, in this case, if you just had the thought to bring it in, it should not be disqualified. So again, this Mishnah is consistent with our Mishnah. It's not disqualifying, and they contradict the brisa. So the Gemara says, well, how do we explain the contradiction between the brisa and the Mishnayos? Trei Tanai, Rabbi Yehuda. There are two Tanaim arguing with Rabbi Yehuda, and so the Mishnah that says it's not disqualifying follows the Mishnah on Pei Beis, where it's consistent. V'sav Rabbi Yehuda chata sheshachta b'darom yechayev. Does Rabbi Yehuda really say that if you slaughter the sin offering in the southern part of the courtyard, you're disqualified? On top of 36b, Vatanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yachol chata sheshachta b'darom yechayev. Tam Omer lo tizbacha shemol kecha shor vaseh. Called Davaral. If there's a blemish, it's disqualified, but not if you slaughter in the south. Again, a contradiction to this. Again, a contradiction to the source that we saw from Rabbi Yehuda, that he says that you're liable for lashes for slaughtering the chatas in the south. So my answer is again the same answer. Trei Tanai Aliba de Rabbi Yehuda. Two Tanaim who argue about what Rabbi Yehuda's position is. So now the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Abba. So now we go on to the next piece. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Abba, Umode Rabbi Yehuda, Shechozer V'Kovo L'Pigel. So Rabbi Yehuda says, let's say you have this, remember we're discussing, Rabbi Yehuda says that if you have the machshava l'aniach, that if you have the thought to leave the blood over beyond the proper time, that's disqualifying. The Chum arguments say it's not. Rabbi Yehuda would say if after you have the thought to leave it over beyond the proper time, you then go and say, actually, I want to not just leave it over, but I want to sprinkle it beyond the proper time, then it becomes pigul. That's like the idea we saw earlier, that you can, that the pigul is not if you have another thought involved. And here, however, if you go back and have that thought, Rabbi Yehuda says it will make it pigul. So, as we saw earlier, a similar debate. So the Gemara says that's the chiddush of Rabbi Abba that Rabbi Yehuda would admit in this case. So Amar Rava Teida. So Rava says, I'll prove to you that if you go back and say beyond the proper, meaning say if he had machshava schutz, if he just had an idea to do it beyond the proper place, and then he had the proper time, then we would say that it's machshavas muravos, and it cannot be pigul because there was two thoughts involved. But in this case, where you just had the thought to leave it over, then Rabbi Abba says it would be pigul. If you after that thought you thought to sprinkle it, that would make it pigul. And Rabbi says, I'll prove it to you. Teda the pigul of nezrika will kumhu, that if you have the pigul thought that to eat it beyond the proper time, and it's before the blood was actually sprinkled, and you eat the meat, then it's nothing because you hadn't sprinkled the meat. The pigul only takes effect once you sprinkle the meat. The asi zrika the kavalo pigul. So the zrika comes along and establishes the pigul, and that proves that the leaving it over beyond the proper time is not like the other machshavas. So we'll look at the Rashi. He says, Rava Teda, I'll prove to you the machshavas sinuach Rabbi Yehuda lav k'machshavas chotzam komo. That the thought to just leave it over beyond the proper time is not like it can become pigul, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and not like the thought beyond the proper place and shalol lishma, which uproots it from pigul. The ha pigul, the shochet amanaslis rokas etamol machar b'fnei zrika. Because if you have the thought to sprinkle it beyond the proper time, but before the sprinkling actually takes place, it's nothing, and you don't get kares if you eat it. And the whole thought process only makes it pigul once the blood is sprinkled today, and that's when the carbon has brought all of its so-called matira. However, but the first thought that you actually had, anytime you're doing a pigul, you're saying, I'm going to leave it over and then sprinkle it. And the sprinkling comes along and establishes that initial thought. And we don't say, since from the beginning, since from the beginning when you had the thought there wasn't yet pigul yet because you didn't sprinkle the blood, and now it's disqualified from pigul. And then when you sprinkle it, the pigul wouldn't apply. So every pigul is really a breakdown of first the thought of leaving it over, and then you actually sprinkle it. And so therefore, we don't say that disqualifies it from pigul. So also here it shouldn't disqualify it. That's Rava's argument. But the Gemara says, no, it's totally different. There, it's one thought. You said together, I'm going to leave it over and sprinkle it as one concept. Here, it's two separate actions, two separate thoughts. First, you say, I'm going to leave it over. And then later on, you come and say, you're going to sprinkle it. It's two separate thoughts. Kosher. Let's say you have in mind to put it in the wrong place. If you intend to do it is immediately, then it's going to be kosher, like we learned in our Mishnah. But chazer v'chishev, but let's say you come back and then you had it in the second avoda chutzlam komo possible ve'imbo kares. If let's say during the shlita you had in mind to sprinkle beyond the proper place, beyond the different place on the altar, it's kosher. Then if you said during let's say the kabbalah, you say I'm going to eat the meat beyond the proper place, it's possible ve'imbo kares. It's disqualified, you don't get kares. Chutz lizmano pigo v'chayav and olav kares. But if you have the intent to eat it beyond the proper time, that's pigul and chayav olav kares. But if at the first thought you thought l'machar to do it beyond, do it in the wrong place, on the altar, either above or below, the next day, which is beyond the proper time, puzzle, because that's going to be disqualifying. Because we're going to say that you intended to leave the blood over for the next day, and that's going to be disqualifying. But let's say you then thought and we see from here that you can establish it. It only makes it possible and not kares. So this is exactly the opposite of what Rabbi Abba said. Rabbi Abba said that if you have initial thought of machshavas leinuach and then you had a pigul thought, that makes it kares. But here we're saying that this is a refutation of Rabbi Abba Tiyufta to Rabbi Abba Tiyufta. Let's say you thought that a tamei person should eat it tomorrow, so beyond the proper time. So you might think that this is a pigul penalty, and so therefore, since he thought that even though the eating is being done by a tamei person, we're going to say it's chayav kares. And we don't say that since the tamei person is prohibited to eat kachim, so we're going to say aside from the achila beyond the proper time, there's also a machshavas possible, and therefore you don't get pigul. We don't say that. And Amar Rabba Teda, I'll prove it to you. It's ironic that this is different than the case if you have in mind. Tosos asked the question, well, if you have in mind to eat lo dami lachilas klavim, Tosos says, what about dogs? We said that there you would get pigul. If you had in mind that the dog would eat it, remember we said yesterday. But here, if you have in mind the tummy person would eat it, we're going to say, if you have in mind that the dog would eat it, we say you don't get pigul. But in this case, we say you do. And it says Rabbi Teida, the baso if neizrika lo chazi. Let me just say this again. So if let's say you have in mind that the tummy person will eat this the next day, so you have in mind chutz lizmano, but it's going to be eaten by a tummy, then we're going to say chayev that under those circumstances it is pigul and you're liable kares. And we don't say that since the tummy is disqualified by kachim, therefore it's possible. And says Rava, Teida, I'll prove it to you. The basar with neizrika. Well, because all meat before the sprinkling ever happens is not edible. You can't eat it. So it's like a tummy. But then when you have in mind to eat it the next day, mifsal, and even though it's not edible at that moment, you have in mind to eat it the next day, it becomes pigul. Veloi, it's not the it's a inadequate proof. Therefore, it's not a problem in the person eating it. It just hasn't been sprinkled yet. And so then when you sprinkle, it becomes edible. But here with the intent that a tummy person, it would never be edible to be eaten. So okay, and Tosfos talks about why it's different than the case of the dog. So that there was this phrase that he used to say all the time. Basar b'Pesach shalot. So let's say you have the carbon Pesach's meat that was not yet roasted, and so therefore you can't do the mitzvah. If you have the Thanksgiving bread, you hadn't yet separated, you're supposed to take away 10% of the loaves, 4 loaves, to give them to the Kohen. You hadn't yet separated it. Meaning to say, even though the meat is not, you're not allowed to eat the carbon Pesach if you're tummy. You're not allowed to eat the carbon toda bread if you're tummy. But you're also not allowed to eat it if it's not roasted. And you're also not allowed to eat it if the bread was not separated. So let's say you ate it before you roasted the meat, it was still raw, or you ate it before you had separated. We're going to say, even though you're tameh, you're going to be liable for kares. And even though we have a general principle, you're only liable for tumah, for eating something while you're tameh, if it was able to be eaten by people who are tahar. Nevertheless, since the blood of the toda and of the paschal has already been sprinkled, it's going to be seen as though it's permitted. And so therefore you're liable for kares. Even though you can't eat it, you're not supposed to eat it. If you ate it, you're going to be liable for kares because the blood was sprinkled, even though the meat is not yet fully roasted. And if you were, no, for those prohibitions, you would not be liable for kares. But if you generally speaking ate the Paschal lamb while you're tameh, then you're liable for kares. Or if you ate the Thanksgiving offering while you're tameh, you're liable for kares. You might have thought, well, since this food is not, I'm not allowed to eat it, I'm not liable for kares. We say, no, you're still liable. And Amarava Teida, I'll prove it to you, Tanya, because it says, with respect to Achilas Kachim, it says, that if a person eats from the carbon, that is for Hashem. And the words Hashem are extra. To teach us, to tell us that if you ate the innards of the kachif kalim, which are supposed to be offered in the temple while you're tameh, that you're liable for kares. Even though you're not supposed to eat them, they're supposed to go on the mizbeach. Nevertheless, you're liable for your tamah. Even though it's not, you're not allowed to eat it, you're liable for tumah. And Gemara says it's a bad logic. Well, no, those are Muri Kachikalim. The reason why you're going to be liable is because they could be eaten by the tent, by the altar. Unlike the Paschal, which is not yet roasted, and the Thanksgiving offering, which is not yet separated, nobody could eat from it at that point. And so therefore, it's not a good comparison. We'll return to this chapter, but don't worry, we're not yet done with the laws of Pigul. We still have a few more days of Pigul. Yeah, Shekayach to everybody.